Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Let's Talk. I'm really excited about my guest today. I met her years ago when I was in Michigan, and honestly, I hadn't spoken to her for way too long. And really glad to be able to share a conversation with you today. Before I introduce her, though, as always, I just want to encourage you, if you have questions, please ask them. It's not often that we get to talk to a psychologist of Shawn's caliber. She's absolutely fantastic, and I got the benefit of preparing some questions ahead of time. But if you have any, please go ahead and ask. It makes the time just a little bit more interactive, a little bit more fun. But that said, let's dive into it, and let me introduce my guest for today, Dr. Shawn Hondorp. Dr. Hondorp is a board-certified clinical health psychologist living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She has a private practice, a podcast called Motivation Made Easy, Body Respect, True Health. And in that podcast, she explores how our common approaches to weight loss and health often run counter to what we know about motivation science. I know I've listened to a couple episodes. I really liked it a lot. I think you probably will too. But Shawn, we're going to come on my show for now. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here.
Yeah, well, so to get us started, could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you in your mission to change how we think about wellness, to change how we think about weight? How did you get here?
Yeah, I mean, my mission in terms of like talking about these things more openly is like newer, although I've been in this field really from really early on in college. I started studying eating disorders, and then I started focusing more on the idea of like weight management. But I was just noticing, and even advisors that I'd work with were sort of acknowledging how bad we are as a field at helping people lose weight and keep it off. So I had an advisor really top in the field talk about V studies where people would lose weight, so weight loss is possible, but then they gradually regain it over time. So there's sort of this like drop V and then a gradual regain that's really, really common. And it ends up becoming pretty frustrating as a provider wanting to help people achieve lasting, sustainable results. And so throughout my career, I've started to think a little bit more about where we're going wrong and some of the main areas that I think we're missing the mark, and giving that information that I, as a researcher, like in the field, somewhat knows, but we talk about very rarely. And so just the idea, like you said, the way that we approach this is very counter to motivation science. And there's really well-studied theories about motivation and how important it is to have autonomous motivation. And I'm sure we'll dive into that. And the way we approach it is usually not autonomous. And then we also rarely talk about the biology and how weight is very heavily biologically determined. So that also can set people up for failure or feeling like a failure, and which undermines autonomy and undermines feelings that we need to make sustainable change. So I love what I do. I'm super passionate about it. And I think more people deserve to have this information so they can feel empowered and positive about it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about weight, when you talk about wellness, when you talk about food, it really is such a multi-dimensional and multi-specialty area. And a lot of times when we think about weight loss or you think about programs, there's this focus on like just say like the food or on calories or on like just that action. But actually creating lasting change is really hard. And, you could do anything for a little while. You could like grit and bear it and like try to get through, but actually changing something in a permanent way where like your set point is different, that's a lot harder. And that's kind of a little bit more what we as psychologists deal in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love what I do because it's really complicated, but it's also really challenging for people to sort of wrap their heads around all of this. And we all eat and we all have bodies, and there's a lot of opinions out there about this worked for me and shouldn't it work for you. So there's just a lot of complicating factors that are problematic. And so I don't want to dive into some of those, but even just the weight loss industry, for example, has a pretty strong stake in people not having success and continuing to be repeat customers. So we got some many factors working against us.
Oh man, so an industry supporting a problem that could be otherwise preventable. Now you're talking my language. That's That's what I talk about all the time.
Yeah, I'm
But
sure you
you're
have.
right. Like we all have to eat. We all have bodies, except for me. I'm a hologram.
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
just joking. We do. But this is actually a good segue to my first question, which is I always like to put things in context. And right now, our context has a lot to do with the pandemic and has to do with COVID. And I know that, so on the addiction side of the street, which is more my specialty, there's been a huge uptick in a lot of addictive behaviors and addictive consequences, like more people buying the substances, more people overdosing on opioids, all those sorts of things. Addiction, of course, is a type of coping behavior, and a lot of times people treat food in the same sort of way. And so I was wondering, what have you seen over the last year in terms of the impact of this pandemic on people's behaviors around food and around wellness?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's a kind of a similar story where, from a actual just weight perspective, people are continuing to struggle with weight gain. And so I have my stats here about 42% of US adults have gained some weight. The average is about 29 pounds, so not a small amount. And that's higher among parents, so 36 pounds on average, and essential workers, 38 pounds. So, it's not that surprising given that we know everything that's going on in terms of
Let
like
me. So you're saying an average weight gain is 36 pounds over the pandemic for people who gain weight.
among the folks who report undesired weight gain, yeah, which is
Holy moly,
42%. Yep.
that is a lot. That is a
Mhm.
lot. Wow. Okay.
Mhm. Mhm. I know that's yeah, I recently found that stat, so I wanted to pull that in, but it is a lot. And again, you think about parents and essential workers, the people that are probably the most spread thin, the most burnt out. We see an increase of emotional eating, but also just I always say eating disorders and food difficulties are on a continuum and on a spectrum. So there's higher rates of disordered eating. Eating disorders diagnosable, but it's all on a spectrum. And so we're seeing a lot of, and the way we approach weight gain is like, ooh, I got to start a diet. In fact, I tell this story a lot about my mother-in-law who hasn't really struggled much with her weight, but she gained a little weight recently, not necessarily pandemic related, but she's like, I'm going to have to do a diet. And then she listened to the podcast and she's like, oh no, I don't need to do a diet. And so I'm like, correct. Because diets tend to be associated with more weight gain. And so what we don't want to do is do something that's going to make us feel worse and push up our stress and push up our set point, which is sort of the weight biologically our bodies like to hang out at. So yeah, we need a new approach.
Yeah, yeah, and probably not amphetamines either, right? Like I'd imagine that's probably not really changing your standpoint.
Probably not. You're the expert
Probably
there. I
not.
don't know, but I'm gonna guess probably not.
Probably not. Yeah, no, we want sustainable change. We want healthy change. That's ultimately, I think, in any side of psychology, really, as as therapists, what we're trying to help people achieve. But so you brought up this question of diets, and one element that you're known for in terms of your podcast, in terms of what you do professionally, is trying to help people break away from diet mentality. And so I know you touched on this just right now a little bit, the idea that diets actually might be counterproductive. But could you talk a little bit more about what diet mentality is and why it's actually so toxic?
Yeah, so the diet mentality, I think, can be a number of different things, but really it's a thinking pattern. It's different than the behaviors that might be associated with what people quote unquote think of a diet. So it's not necessarily how you eat and how you move, it's how you're thinking about it. So it tends to be associated with rigid, all or nothing thinking, labeling foods as good or bad, labeling yourself as good or bad, having your weight very tied up with your self worth, and feeling like if you are not doing well, you're failing. Another belief that's really common is like lack of trust in your body. So when people have been on a lot of external programs to tell them what to eat, they start to say, well, I need those programs to sort of like to get in control. But the problem is like a lot of rules tend to make us feel less in control. And so it's a vicious cycle. You could see how this would be a vicious cycle. People kind of increasingly losing faith in themselves. So a lot of people I work with say, I don't get it. Like I'm really competent at this area of my life and this area, my career is going well, my family life is going well. Not always, but many people I work with feel that way. And they're like, this is just I don't know, I just can't control myself in this area. And it's a lot of times the way we're thinking about it and many times working against our biology. But yeah, that mentality is different than the behavior itself.
So really, when we talk about a diet, is is it that idea of the V? Is it that idea of the yo-yo, or that it's just something that you do for a period of time that's kind of put upon you by an external structure? Is that what you would say diet mentality is?
Yeah, I mean, diet mentality is like all those thinking patterns I mentioned. Like I said, it's separate from the behavior per se, but a lot of times one of the ways we commonly approach weight loss is like calorie monitoring. And so going to, standard, and I recommended this in weight loss trials as recently as like 8 years ago or so, 1,200 calories or maybe 1,500 calories or less, monitoring, restricting, and that rarely works. So when you talk about those V studies, we're referencing those. Occasionally people have success with that, but it's like less than 5%.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that approach somehow leads you to something sustainable, you'd be in the minority there. So it's, again,
Yeah.
the behavior. And some people will say, well, dieting worked for me. I made some shifts. I, made some changes to my eating. I lost 10 or 15 pounds and I kept it off. Dieting worked for me. But that's a different categorical thing than perhaps someone who's trying to lose like 70 or 100 pounds. So we need to be careful about comparing, like, this worked for me, and all of our bodies are different, right? So like what specific type of eating style that's going to work for you is going to be different than for me, most likely, and different than someone else with a whole different set of preferences and medical history and all of that.
Yeah. Well, so then what would you say we should be shooting for instead? If it's not diets, then if
Mm-hmm.
someone feels like they're not at a healthy weight, what should they be doing?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, but I would say, and I think everyone probably has on a continuum as well, the impact of the diet mentality, like how much shame and disorder is caught up in it. So if you're really caught up in it, and you've had a lot of sort of layers we need to uncover a little bit, I think first we just need to like understand what those were and understand that like you didn't fail, the system failed you, right? And the system's failing a lot of people. So we need to take that out so we can look at it more objectively. But once we do that, and sometimes working with a professional can be really useful in that, obviously, but stepping back and saying like, what's really counter to the way we approach weight loss is like this idea of like consistent, gradual, continual improvement, but yet we know that's actually kind of how behavior change and anything we do in our life tends to work well. It's not like this overnight overhaul and success, right? It's not like, oh, I wasn't walking at all and now I'm about to run a marathon. It's like gradual, consistent change and feeling good about that and then building from there, right? It's just like, it's not like super thrilling, and yet it can
Yeah.
be because it works better. So yeah, looking at like what's realistic for me right now, and sometimes it's taking the pressure off of our health, and our weight is the only thing that matters. We're a very weight centric culture. We think that weight is just all the end all be all for our health, and that's not true. And there's a lot more that goes into our health. And so sometimes it's like not necessarily not worrying about that at all. And obviously every situation is different. But broadening that picture and saying, are there other things we need to focus on, like stress management or coping differently with what's going on in our life or making a change in our life, right? So it's,
Mm-hmm.
we get so
So,
fixated on like the calories in, calories out, and it's not that simple.
yeah. Well, so would you say it's kind of more like a wellness mentality, or is it more like what should, if the focus shouldn't be on the calories, where should we be? And generally, and I know everybody's different, but generally
Mm-hmm.
speaking, what should we be focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, I would focus on what you add in versus what you take out. So restriction tends to backfire. So I would focus on where you can add, whole unprocessed foods. And so that's pretty universal. There's a lot of different nutrition camps, right? And I, as a psychologist, I do my best to stay up on things, but I don't think there's one eating plan that's best for everyone. But I do think more fresh, whole, unprocessed stuff. Less processed food, less sugar, absolutely. Trying to get pleasure and enjoyment from our eating, but doing so in a way that's perhaps more like, again, holistic, and looking at ways that we can move and yeah, in terms of like the eating exercise piece, I would focus on like definitely more what to add in. And so
Mm-hmm.
actually one of the things that sometimes I'll talk about is like, there's exceptions to this, but the way I would approach eating well for like kids is actually pretty similar to the way I would approach it for adults, is like a rule of thumb. And this sort of the way we approach it in our family is like we try to keep our environment as healthy as possible and whole unprocessed food. So it's just like easy to make there's a concept of optimal defaults. That's sort of just the idea that we do the easy choice. Like, so the example is like
Mm-hmm.
organ donation countries that it's an opt-in for organ donation policy. They tend to have, if you have to opt in, they have lower rates of it with like the US. So just making the healthier choice the default choice. So that would be controlling your food environment, but not
Yeah.
having a restrictive environment, right? So never making foods bad or good, not labeling them good or bad. That's the same thing I would recommend for a kid as an adult. So like have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
healthy stuff available, to put it in short. Make it easy to grab. And then when you bring in sweets or things like that, have it in smaller quantities so that like once you have it, you enjoy it. And once it's gone, it's gone. Because our food environment outside the home, we don't obviously have as much control over.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like what you're describing is shaping the kind of like the culture around food in your house, in your life, and really focusing on that. Like, how do you engage with it? What do you have handy? What are you emphasizing in terms of different parts of your diet? And then is kind of the idea that if we're strengthening that, that the weight aspect just takes care of itself.
Yeah, I mean, kids are a great example. They're born eating relatively intuitively for the most part, as long as there's nothing medically going wrong. But most of the time they eat intuitively. They don't over focus on food until we impose that restriction on them. Usually it can be imposed pretty young, unfortunately. So we want to keep that environment as neutral as possible. Food's food. We don't label foods as like good or bad or even healthy or unhealthy at home. We're just like, this is food. It's good or it's not good, or it is what it is, right? So my kids are little, so it's like easier now because I have more control. We'll see as they get older.
All right, so I'm going to ask a personal question here because
Go for it.
I've got you, and I have a question. So how do you handle then, right, when you've got your kid, and by your kid I mean my kid, like you've got, say you've got like a dinner, and the dinner consists of tater tots, green beans, and a veggie burger because we're vegetarian in my house. And all that's being eaten are the tater tots. How do you handle, and it's not that they don't like the other things, it's just that the tater tots taste really good. How do you handle that sort of situation in terms of trying to justify why you're saying, hey, so you can't have more tater tots until you eat other things? And if you're not hungry, we always say, if you're not hungry, that's okay. You don't have to eat, but we're going to, put the kibosh on the tater tots until something else goes away. Like how best to handle that and not create that negative food culture?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I honestly don't stress about it if they don't eat the other things. I think it'll even it itself out. So I don't worry too much about it. In terms of like the tater tots, I probably just like make enough. So like we split it among the family members that are there. Everyone gets a reasonable portion, and naturally, it's once it's gone, it's gone. So it's not like you are not allowed to have more. It's like we're done. We have no more left. And like making sure, like, are you still hungry? Do you want anything else? We got this left. But you see, it's like setting up the environment to minimize that feeling of restriction. But but not stressing about like it's gonna even out over time. I think as parents, I don't know, maybe because I've been doing this for a long time, I don't struggle as much with that. But I know a lot of my friends and a lot of people I work with do have a lot of anxiety of like, but they're not eating enough. They'll eat when they're hungry. It'll be fine. I don't worry about that per se. I know that's easier said than done. But
no, it's a good point. We have a lot of catastrophic thoughts, as parents, like if they don't eat enough vegetables, will only one arm grow, or, like you don't want to get to the point of them getting scurvy, but like scurvy does take a while. So I guess you just kind of have to take this balanced approach.
Yep. Deep breath. The scurvy takes quite a while, Aaron. It's fine.
Yeah. We're not actually on a pirate ship. I don't know. Anyway, you got to have some balance in your diet. All right. So let's get back to the questions that I actually wrote down. So back to dieting for a second. What are some myths that people think of about diets that you want to clarify for us today? Because again, I know that before we started talking recently, and before I listened to your podcast, looked at some of your material, I didn't necessarily think of dieting as bad. I just thought of it as, something that personally I haven't really done very much in the past of. But I didn't really see it in the way that I do now. So what are some areas where people might have a misconception about dieting that would be helpful to clear up?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say too, to your point there, like dieting per se isn't always bad for everyone. However, a lot of times it is for the reasons that we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about, but it is about like how you think about it, right? So that person that like might be like, I want to lose a little bit and they make a few shifts, like they might think of that as a little bit of a diet, but that's very different than someone who feels like a lot of pressure to get their weight down, a lot of pressure from even from well-intentioned medical professionals and people in their life. But there's just a huge focus on that. And so there's several myths that I like to talk about. One is just, and we kind of touched on this idea of like dieting works for most people if you just stick to it. So, and that's kind of tied up with this idea of like just suck it up, do it, willpower. And that's not actually how it works. And I share in the podcast, and I'm very open now with like, I did like healthy dieting for many, many years. I was never like going below 1,200 calories. And if I exercise, I would eat more. And it's just, I know now, like that just wasn't like it wasn't me failing. It's an ineffective system for most people. And I was certainly one of them. Because our bodies don't like to be deprived. And so being able to take the shame away, because there's a lot of shame and guilt about like, I'm failing and I can't do this and other people can and I can't. And like, that's actually really, really rare. I'm not saying it's not possible, but like, it's incredibly rare for people to lose a significant amount of weight with dieting and keep it off in a really sustainable way. So like, if you haven't been able to do that, that's not on you, that's on the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense because it makes me think of, I don't know if you ever read the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but I
I
really
don't
like
think I
it.
did. Yeah,
It's a
I've heard
really
of it.
cool book, worth reading, an oldie but a goodie. But one of the
Mm-hmm.
aspects that he talks just in the very beginning about is the idea that there's lots of tricks that people try to like say that like this will help you succeed in business or this will help you succeed in life, but ultimately like the manipulations aren't what get you where you need to go. It's more of like a character change where you're actually like engaging with people differently or with emotions differently, actual habits, more character change than just behavior change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, and like, and how you think about yourself. And if you're so tied up in like, I'm trying this thing that everyone's trying to tell me is the right thing to do and I'm failing, that can really erode your sense of self-worth, trust in your body, and then sort of I think about like sometimes people are like, well, is this like anti-diet mentality approach going to help me lose weight? That's probably the biggest question I get from people, which is a valid question. And my answer is it kind of depends. It may or may not. It depends on your biology, to be honest, more so than anything. But like the best way, it's sort of a backdoor approach to get to optimal health, is to like learn to trust your body and realize it's not you failing. And it might result in some weight loss, right? And it kind of depends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so how do you reconcile then if this V weight, loss and then gain is the norm, and a lot of times weight doesn't stay off. Why do people keep dieting? Why do we keep seeing the new diets? Why does this myth that this is actually helpful persist?
That's a great question. I think it's a complicated one. I think like I said, the weight loss industry is very invested in people believing that it works, and you just got to find the right exact specific way. And that this program or this new fad, I mean, we continue to see new fads come out all the time about like, well, this is the way, right? And this hope, and I think we have such a weight focused culture and such a inaccurate notion that heavier, larger bodies are unhealthy and bad, that not only is that stigmatizing and shaming to them, which definitely causes stress and health problems, but there's not actually good data to suggest that like body size itself is a predictor of health problems. It's a correlational study, right? So like we can't randomly assign two people to like one to stay at the same body weight and one to lose weight and keep it off for 10 years. We can't do that. So it's all correlation, and we can't really parse out this effect of stress and everything. So, but because societally it's so unacceptable to be in a larger body and it's so challenging to live in the world, like you're not going to experience equal status in society. So that's another reason there's a lot of pressure, right? It's like I want to belong and be accepted for who I am, but everywhere I turn, I'm told I'm not good enough, I'm told I'm not healthy, and I'm told I'm weak-willed and all of those things, right? So there's a even more complicated component if we're talking about someone in a much heavier body, right? Someone not just like, oh, I'm trying to lose 20 some pounds.
Yeah, so kind of like the demand is always there because people are always going to be, because of the society that we're living in, if nothing else, dissatisfied with their bodies. And so they're looking for solutions. And something's novel, something's new. People say that there's science behind it. And then all of a sudden, people are eating no sugar and burning fat.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The system's definitely set up to continue to funnel people through this ineffective system. So that's one of the reasons I think as a researcher and like you're just like, wait, people don't really know this. And there's a push to have people understand this data more, but it's in the grand scheme still a slow push or a slow movement, if you will. Sort of there's different names for it, but basically, yeah, it's we're kind of fighting a lot of systems.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that there's a range of relationship of eating, and maybe on both extremes, there's something that you could potentially call like clinical, or something that's actually pathological, either eating way too much or way too little. And maybe even if you're in those extremes, maybe even your hunger cues are off. Maybe even your body doesn't quite speak to you in the way it otherwise would. But if you're somewhere in the middle, which most of us probably are, because most of us probably don't have diagnosable eating disorders, really it's just about listening to yourself and trying to engage in healthier habits, and not just eating to cope, or not just restricting to cope, but just going with what feels right.
Yeah, absolutely. You hear a lot about mindfulness, mindful eating. There's good evidence that all those things help in terms of improving your relationship with food, reducing binge eating, reducing emotional eating, not necessarily consistently associated with weight loss, but I think that doesn't mean that like that can't be a part of a wellness journey, if you will, right? But yeah, I think and also sort of accepting like your genetic blueprint and your body and where it's at. That's a really tough thing for people to do, understandably, because of all the things we talked about. But it's going to be a lot easier to get in touch with your body if you're working with it instead of against it. So that's a lot of times what I talk to people about, like, this is the body you have, and this is it's gotten to the place that it's gotten to because of your history. And like I said, dieting unfortunately can push that set point up, which is, I think we need to learn a little more about set point, but basically your body's temperature gauge, where your body likes to hang out, the weight that is, and there's a range that it might hang out comfortably. So working within that and finding something that's actually doable, where you're not like fighting tooth and nail and fighting your biology, is important.
Do you think it's a fair statement to say that for most of us, our set point, if we actually were in tune with it and we were listening to ourselves, would be within like a healthy BMI? Or are there really a lot of people where the set point would be either too high or too low?
The BMI is a crap measure. It's what we have. It's it's simple and effective, and it's what we use for years. And it's the only good things about BMI is like it's easy to capture, right? Like you can have someone weigh themselves at home and get their weight, but it's really not an evidence-based measure at all. And so we're not good at accepting body diversity. So unfortunately, when someone, and even on both sides of the extreme too, so there's so much data that like, even let's say if someone's at a BMI of 24, but they have like health problems, but then they'd go to their doctor and their doctor would be like, well, your BMI is in the normal range, you're good. Same thing with someone who might have a BMI of 30, and then they're told you're obese and you're obese, you're creeping up there, we need to do something about it. That might be the healthiest weight for their body, right? And it's only when we continue to do chronic dieting we can push that up. So I think ideally we start earlier accepting body diversity as soon as possible, age-wise, right? So we can prevent, so many of my people that I've worked with have had, all of these problems for many years, and it is harder to reverse, right? So their body at some point might have had a set point that was a lot lower, and now it's higher. And so that's But yes, I think it's a very problematic measure. And so, as someone who was in healthcare for many years, um, I mean, I used it. We all used it, right? It's what we're used to. But we need,
Yeah.
we ideally should not be using it, or at least we need to look at it differently.
So you'd say that really what matters most is function. If your body's
Mhm.
working well, if your lab is, like
Yep.
you're not putting additional like that, that's really the thing to focus on, regardless of the BMI. And if your cholesterol is fine and your blood glucose, if everything is fine and you just have a larger body, then you don't have to be concerned about that. But if you have a larger body and it's not fine, then you definitely have to pay attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, always working with your doctor, but looking at like how you eat, how you move. What we know, and they've done studies where they've looked at health habits, like 4 health habits of people in like a normal weight range, overweight, and obese BMI. And what they show is that health risk or risk of death is higher among people with in the obese range if they're not doing any of the 4 healthy habits like exercise, balanced eating, not smoking, not drinking to excess. But if they're
Mm-hmm.
doing 4 of those behaviors similar to someone in the normal weight range, their risk of death is exact same. So it's this idea that like it's so unhealthy is not true. And there's other complicating factors that might be driving up that risk, such as weight stigma that we're not measuring too. So it's not necessarily like, oh, well, they're definitely, if they're not doing all these behaviors, then they're definitely unhealthy. It's just more complicated than that, essentially. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. Something as multifaceted as physical health, trying to like boil it all down to like one number or one ratio. Like if you think about it, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. Exactly. Like we are way more than that number.
Yeah. Well, so what does this mean? What does this all mean for people who might be listening, who are on a diet, who might have been, might be doing, like keto, paleo, Atkins, something like that? Should they mortified recoil and start eating differently? Like how should they approach it?
I would ask, like, thinking about those different eating styles, like, how do you feel when you're on that eating style? If you're like, Shawn, I feel good when I'm eating the ketogenic style way, then that's a different story, right? But if you're like, no, I'm miserable and I'm only doing it to try to get the number on the scale down and it's not working and I'm frustrated every day, then we need to look at it differently, right? And we need to step back and say, how is this impacting your sense of yourself? And how is it actually working? And why do you think that this is the right way? Um, so yeah, really stepping back and just saying, like, how can I make some shifts in how I eat and move and take care of myself more broadly that help me feel good and energized throughout my day and get me out of this back and forth cycle of shame and guilt. And there's so much stress caught up in this for, like I said, on a continuum, but it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty universal. A lot of people that I work with, even who might have clinical diagnoses, sometimes we say like, well, let's think about the people in your life and how they think about some of these things. And some of them know some people that have sort of like some peace and calm in their relationship with food. And a lot of them, like, everyone I know struggles like this, right? Like, it's not just people that come to therapy that are struggling with this. We have what's often referred to as like diet culture, or sort of this obsession is very universal. So I think also talking to people in your life and maybe sharing this talk or sharing the podcast and saying, like, can we start to make some shifts on a broader social level, because we are very influenced by our social environment and the way beliefs everyone has about these things. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what, that's definitely one of the things that I did do the podcast for, right? Is like, let's on a broader level start to have different conversations about this. And then on a specific level, telling people in your life what's helpful and what isn't. Like if someone's being the food police and telling you, do you really want that? Saying, maybe that's not so helpful, right? um,
Yeah.
and I love to talk about autonomy. So autonomy is just the freedom from excessive pressure to behave in a certain way and how essential that is. And so, ideally you have healthcare professionals that support your autonomy in all decisions, right? And you try to choose people that support that. But that's obviously not always the case. But communicating with the people in your life and saying, like, this is helpful to me, this isn't. And when they don't do it, saying, I look, when you do this, I'm going to, set a boundary or whatever. Or like when you food police me, I'm going to leave, or I'm going to remind you that that's not helpful. And I don't know, it's very challenging obviously to change other people's behavior, but calmly stating what's important to you is a great first step.
Yeah, yeah. Well, something that I'm just reflecting on right now is, and I love that you have this approach, is that like a really good psychologist, you will not tell anybody what to do. You're just going to talk
Right.
about options and mindsets. And I think, no, I think that's wonderful. Like, I actually should get more psychologists on this show, because it's just funny to like almost like see myself in that way. But what I hear you saying is like, there's nothing it's not about what's right or wrong, or even necessarily what's healthy and unhealthy. It's about how it makes you feel. Like there's no truth with a capital T here. A lot of it's relative. I mean, maybe sometimes there is truth with a capital T if your body is wasting away, or, if you're seeing that clearly it's not functional. But, that part aside, you just have to figure out what's right for you. And if you like eating all fat and no sugar, then maybe you keep that up. Or if it makes you feel good and you're happy with it, or you really like the structure or whatever's there and you thrive that way, more power to you. But if you're finding that, like apparently for most people, trying to live within that structure actually makes you feel constricted and neurotic and guilty and all of those sorts of things, then maybe it's not actually doing for you what you want it to.
Exactly. Yes. And yeah, I always have this sort of fear as I share different things about my personal journey, but I'm like, but that might be different for you. Like I can share you what worked for me, and I can share that like our family, this is what we do, and we eat like a decent amount whole food, plant-based, but not totally. And like that might not be right for you, right? Like there's good evidence for that, and I talk about that. But yeah, ultimately you always have to come back to, because people are so distrustful of themselves and their own body that they're so prone to like, well, maybe I have to try that. And you certainly could as an experiment. And the other thing I'll say too is that sometimes people too, they hear this and they're like, well, is it bad if I have external motivation, like in the form of like going to, for some reason recently, a lot of people have like really loved CrossFit and they're like this community and they're like, but that's external motivation. I'm like, well, actually this like support and accountability factor, I think really is helpful for all of us for behavior change. So that's the other thing I'd encourage people to do is any behavior you're trying to change, think about how you can build a support and accountability structure around it that isn't shaming, that isn't pressuring, but is truly, so like I think I've heard some CrossFit gyms can be really great with that. I don't know, I've never done CrossFit, but to be able to find an environment where you feel like you can thrive in that and feel really good. That's not diet culture per se, unless you're going in there and they're shaming you if you don't finish the workout, then maybe it is. But really starting to look at some of these support structures that we can build around health, I think it's going to be really key for actually making any significant change.
It's like the difference between relying on those external supports in order to be okay versus being enhanced by them, or being supported by them. So if you are starting to drift in a negative direction, you kind of like come up into that bumper and it kind of like bumps you back in, and you're back where you need to be in more of a healthy line, versus like just leaning on it all the time. And if it were to disappear, you'd be falling.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. I've like had a very positive relationship with like running and exercise pretty much my whole life, which I've been grateful. But part of the reason I've been able to have that is I don't pressure myself. But 100% one of the reasons I got into it was like going to a running group and knowing everyone else was going to show up at Tuesday at 6 p.m. Right. And so I don't do that now, and that developed that like what I'll talk about, like intrinsic like love of running that I still have.
I think that is so interesting, because I actually really do like to work out. And back when I was in grad school, it was a little bit easier to do it, I think. But I also had a great friend who we worked out together, and like we made a plan and we went. It helped keep us on track. And let me tell you, even though I always feel better when I work out right now, like I am not good at actually making time to do it. Life gets in the way. It doesn't happen. And without that, that person there being like, hey, it's time to go, or like, where are you? Or whatever it is. Like, it's just so much easier to let it slide.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I always, it's we want to get to intrinsic where you're just going to go on your own all the time, but it's like we're never always going to get there. We need some structures and supports, and accountability helps everyone. So
yes, my path of least resistance does not lead down into my basement and my yoga mat and my iPad with workout videos. It usually leads me instead to my tablet and maybe my fridge.
Exactly.
But, but the good news is that I like working out, so at least there's that. But
We got to
less
find
about
an
me.
accountability buddy for you.
I do. We gotta work on that. But all right. So you mentioned shame and guilt, though, and that's
Hmm.
something that again is very familiar to me in terms of the work that I do around addiction, and that there's this cycle that oftentimes happens where someone's feeling bad, they try to cope with it in a certain way that's actually self-destructive, and then they feel bad about it, and then because they feel bad about it, they do it again. Is there a similar sort of style that goes in with dieting and with weight, or how does the shame and guilt look on your side of the street?
Oh, 100%. And I think it's like this idea that we're failing. Somehow we get this idea that like probably because of all the bombardments that we get with like before and after weight loss, like I'm failing, but other people are doing this. They're succeeding, so I can't. What's wrong with me? And there's so much shame and guilt around the eating and weight struggle. It's been interesting as I've had the podcast, even just in the past few months, and I've shared a bit about my personal journey. I've had a lot of people in my personal life share with me that they've struggled in different ways that I never knew. And that's,
Mm.
I struggled for years and a few people knew. It's not like I was totally closed off, but it definitely, a lot of people did not, and a lot of people wouldn't have known. And so, because of that shame, we keep it in, it sort of festers and gets worse versus us pulling it out into light of day and saying, like, this is not your fault that you're not doing this. And it really undermines this idea of, in motivation theory we talk about like the idea of like relatedness or feeling like one belongs, and we can just start to get this weird notion in our head that like I struggle with this, I'm different, I'm defective. And I'm sure there's a lot of overlap with, I mean, shame, I think we all have it, right? We, if we say we don't, we're lying. And so it just looks different for different people. We have different behaviors that we interpret as like something's wrong with me because I can't get this behavior under control, or I have this urge to eat, or I have this urge to use, something's wrong with me. Um, Versus that's a normal response to the environment that I've been placed in. And but then figuring out what
Mhm.
to do with that, right?
It reminds me a little bit, what you're saying reminds me of the idea of radical acceptance that we talk about sometimes in dialectical behavioral therapy, where you can be okay with the way things are right now because it is what is. It is the present, and trying to deny it is only just creates frustration and angst. While at the same time, say, and I want to be different, and I want to improve, and
Mm-hmm.
I want to be able
Mm-hmm.
to grow and better myself. And you can actually hold both of those things at the same time rather than just feeling guilty or bad about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because I, in my body respect program, in the online program, I literally made an image about that yesterday, and really essentially just, yeah, that like self-acceptance and self-improvement and how we can move towards both, and how we can hold like this is where I'm at and clarify what's important to you and values work, and this is where I want to go, and that can be really uncomfortable and really powerful.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't really take the time to think about. I know I didn't until I really did some soul searching of my own. Like, when we judge ourselves harshly, why do we do that? Like, where does that come from? Are we just basically, is it someone else's opinion echoing in our head? Are we making some social comparison that we don't necessarily need to do? But ultimately, like, if we're marking ourselves up against some other standard, like that standard is arbitrary, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times people set it so high that they can never meet it, and it
Mm-hmm.
just keeps them locked into this really negative headspace.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing too that I'll say about dieting, sometimes I talk about like the diet overlay, meaning like people get so caught up in this sort of failure shame cycle that I can't figure this problem out, that they don't look at other areas of their life, and that keeps them from really like moving towards things that are really important to them. So I hate the notion that like if somebody struggles with their eating and their weight, like there must be something really wrong with them. Like that's
Mm.
not true. There's like so many different types of people that struggle with their eating and their weight. And so there's a lot of diversity in terms of what's underneath there, right? It's not, they're not all traumatized, or they don't all have some X problem that people like to categorize. It's complex, but being able to like, when we remove that shame and guilt piece and just like what's there, people can get kind of overwhelmed about looking at what's there, but that's like where the real work can begin of like, am I dissatisfied in this area of my life, or like what am I covering up when I'm, even if it's something more mild like dissatisfaction with my job and I really want to make a change, and I'm coming home and eating chips every night, like what's there, and just being curious, right? And so I think that
Mhm.
that's another really benefit of taking away that layer, but it can feel overwhelming for people if they don't feel like, I don't know if I want to look at that yet.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. There's a phrase that I have that I don't think I made up. So I shouldn't say that I have it. I probably got it from somewhere. But the idea that there's a purpose behind every behavior. That's from DBT. But this idea that if you something doesn't seem to make sense, it's just because there's a part of it that you don't understand. And that's the part that I like to stress a lot when people either are looking at their, say, children's behavior or their own behavior. We don't do things that we don't get something out of. And if we're continuing to repeat a behavior that ultimately is harmful, but we do it anyway, well, there's actually still something that you're getting out of it. Maybe it's familiar. Maybe there is some sort of some positive something that you're getting there, but you've got to figure that part out. Like, what are you gaining from it to be able to actually make a change? But it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It's probably a very human sort of drive that's led you in that direction. Even if it's not necessarily particularly healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And like emotional eating is super adaptive, right? In many ways, but sometimes it can be obviously maladaptive over time. It's leading to weight gain and health complications. But to say like in that moment, or even if sometimes it's easier to think of kids, right? Like if you think about a kid that's in like a really difficult, emotionally neglectful home and they're eating to cope, it's like, you would think that kid's probably pretty adaptive, right? Like they can't go anywhere. And so why as adults do we sometimes we just put a lot of more pressure on adults to like get it together? And yes, we have more awareness and we hopefully have more choices, right? But it just shows the judgment that we have versus just like, let me look at this, look at for what it is, what I'm getting out of this, and where can I make some shifts?
Yeah. Because it's not like we hit some certain age and then all of a sudden we're like wise and we have the answers and it's to be expected that we get everything right.
It'd be nice, right? But
oh man, yeah. Maybe it's in our 40s or something like that. Maybe when I get there, all of a sudden everything will make sense.
Just got a couple more years. All right.
Isn't that like a song from Frozen or Frozen 2 about something like it'll all make sense when I'm older?
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah.
Like
Olaf sings it.
Olaf, yes.
I watch that a lot.
You should get like an honorary doctorate and become a therapist because clearly that is how this all works.
There's intense stuff in Frozen. I'm telling you, some of those songs, I'm like, there's like grief and loss. It's good.
All right. Frozen deep dive. The next podcast we're doing it. We're going in, two psychologists talking about Frozen.
Perfect.
But in the meantime, we got maybe like 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we get to the rest of the things that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
The next one is motivation. And you mentioned that a little bit already. The title of your podcast is Motivation Made Easy. That's the top line title. But motivation can be so tricky and challenging. Like I just mentioned about like me and exercising, that like I like to do it, but then I end up watching something on my iPad or playing a game instead. So what do we need to know in terms of motivation in order to actually make it stick, to actually have motivation and then have that fire keep burning rather than just go out?
Yeah. So first of all, we need to know that it's not you're motivated or not motivated. We just tend to like our brains categorize things, right? But it is more complicated than that. We have different types of motivation for different behaviors. So if you think about the exercise example in the podcast, I break it down. There's basically, technically 5 types of motivation. We don't have to go into all of them per se, but they're like more external or internal, or the other words are controlled motivation or autonomous motivation. And so this is all based on self-determination theory. It's been applied to like every behavior change. So this isn't just like a eating and weight specific theory. And what we need to understand is that to move towards autonomous motivation, we need to understand the social environment. And what they'll talk about in the theory is the 3 key psychological needs that need to be met so that we can move towards autonomous change. And so basically those 3 key needs are autonomy, relatedness, which I mentioned, as well as competence. So feeling effective, feeling like you can do what you set out to do, feeling like you belong and that you're okay as you are, and feeling that autonomous feeling of like not this pressure. So you can see throughout our discussion today of all the areas where we undermine those needs for people struggling with their eating or their weight and the way we approach dieting and all these things. So I think first we need to kind of understand it. That's and that going back to your question earlier. But in terms of when we think about shifting from sort of a should-based motivation or an external motivation to a internal motivation, so I call the internal motivations like I choose to or I want to, maybe both or maybe one. Maybe we don't always want to, right? We know it'd be good for us, but we think, I really don't want to do that, and we all have those things. So autonomy is I choose to or I want to, essentially. Ultimately, it's about choice. And to move towards that, like I said, we have to know what's keeping us in the should cycle. We have to understand that first. But I think we can ask ourselves, like, how do we want to feel? That's a nice question. It's not always a really conscious thing, but when you talk to people who are feeling kind of like autonomously motivated for different things, they're doing that, whether they realize it or not. So they're sort of like, I know I'll feel better when I go for my exercise, and they're sort of doing it from that place. They're probably not shaming and guilting themselves into exercising every single time. Otherwise, that's probably going to be associated with short-term change eventually, and they're probably going to eventually stop. So they're doing it because it helps them to feel better, essentially.
Yeah. So here's a question for you. And a lot of times when I think about change science and getting people to adjust behaviors, there's a really important element of creating small wins and small victories and making it feel like, okay, what I'm doing is actually paying off. I'm not just having to take this on faith. I'm not just kind of trying to build a strong foundation or plant seeds indefinitely, but I'm actually seeing some of them grow and flower. So within this paradigm, and particularly when so many times people tether that feeling of having a win to the scale and to the number that's on the scale, how, and I know that you're trying to bring people away from that, how do you create those wins so that people realize, oh, wait, like what I'm doing here is actually helping and not just wishful thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where a support and accountability system would be really useful in one that gets that, because it can be really hard to celebrate small wins on our own, right? We're easy to discount that. So I mean, yeah, we could shift our internal mindset and remind ourselves like, hey, I don't have to run 3 miles. I can just go out for 5 minutes and that is enough, or walk, or wherever you're at, right? But having that clearly stated, and I'd love for people to have that support and accountability, at least one person that they're like, you know what, I haven't run forever. I really want to get to running a 5K again, but right now this is where I'm at, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to check in with you, and I'm going to celebrate with you. We celebrate well with other people, so I like that. I mean, you could do it on your own, but I think the social component is really helpful for motivation for all these reasons we're talking about. But starting to help them shift that, or look at, people struggle with really noticing like when they feel better, but if you are feeling better when you're eating a certain way, like celebrating that, right? And for some people, not weighing themselves can be very useful for a period of time, if not longer. That's pretty individual, and I know that was one of your questions, but I have people that don't weigh themselves at all, and I have people that weigh themselves more regularly, but it's how you're using that information. How are you using that feedback? Is it really helping you? Is it changing? Is it giving you any like data that's important? If so, then maybe we keep it in, right? But we need to help respond to that in a healthy way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of sounds a bit like you get to set where the bar is, you get to set what you're shooting for. And so as long as it's something that's achievable and healthy, you get to decide if it's okay. I remember, so you mentioned a 5K. I've only run one 5K in my life. It was like 2 or 3 years ago. I did not train for it at all. I am not a runner like you. But I was very happy about the fact that I actually jogged my way through it without actually having to stop once. And, I couldn't walk for like 5 days after that, but I felt really good about that. It felt like
Absolutely.
that made me feel good. That felt like a win, even though I was not like the winner of the race. And I definitely destroyed myself doing it. It felt good because I decided that's what I wanted to, that was a win for me.
Yeah. And you set that expectation at a place where you're like, this is success, right? And that's what I've done. One marathon in my life, I actually am like using these principles to gradually start running again. Like I just walked today. I don't run. I've like had 2 kids and I have not been running quite at all. In fact, I've really lowered the expectation for myself, because if I was like, I got to get back into it, I got to go do all this stuff again, I would be incredibly frustrated, versus setting my expectations at a reasonable level and feeling really great about what I'm able to do, just like you did with your 5K, right? Like we need to do that for ourselves. It's really important. And I mean, if it's super important to you to like go eventually run a marathon, which I will never do again, but for the record, I don't think. But if it's super important to you, you can get there, but it's going to take a while if you're not running at all right now, right? And well, and not all bodies can run. Marathons are very hard on the body, which is why I'm not doing one again. That's a whole other story. Yeah. So yes, celebrate those wins and gradual change. Consistency matters so much more than anything else when it comes to habit change, but we have to start often really small. And in fact, James Clear wrote the book Atomic Habits that many people have heard of now. I feel like he's kind of all over the place, but like in terms of his book is just really popular because he breaks it down really consistently, and it's all about the small, consistent 1% improvement. And so I think that book's a great place to look at if you want to shift away. That's not diet mentality, right? That's like consistent change. So.
Right. Like setting some reasonable goals. Well, we've got to finish up in just a minute, but before we go, I know you just recently launched a new online course, your Body Respect program. Can you tell us just a little bit about that? And I know you put a lot of work into it. What can people expect if they wanted to look into that?
Yeah, it's super fun. We're in the middle of delivering it for our first cohort. So it's all about helping people to like really reclaim that relationship with food, move from external motivation to internal autonomous change, and having an opportunity to explore that. So it's an online course. There's a online community component where people can do all the things we're talking about, right? Have support and accountability for making these shifts. And yeah, it's 8 weeks, and we'll probably launch it open enrollment again in September. And it'll be even better than it's on now because we're going to iterate and improve it, continuous improvement. So it talks about all these things. It talks about digging deep to your values. The module I'm about to deliver is like emotional resilience, courage, and connection, sort of like going to that next level and looking at what that looks like. So it's actually a lot less about eating and weight, but we tie it back to that a lot.
Yeah, that sounds great. And just so that everyone is clear on it, this is a class. This is not therapy. Therefore, anyone can take it anywhere in the world.
Exactly. Yeah. Education and implementation of evidence-based information. And it's been fun.
Marvelous. Well, so if someone wanted to get in touch with you or look into your course, how can they find you?
Yeah, so my website's a good place for all of this. You'll see the course wait list. You'll see my podcast. So drshawnhondorp.com. I know Hondorp's kind of a hard one to spell, but HONDORP for the podcast listeners, not Hondrop. It's a challenging one, but that's a great home base for everything to find me. Or on Instagram, I'm psychology.of.wellness. So that's sort of my overall business name. And then, yeah, the podcast, Motivation Made Easy, Body Respect, True Health is a great way too. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shawn, Dr. Hondorp, not Hondrop, for
exactly.
I definitely misspelled that. It is kind of tough. People say my name wrong all the time too, though. So we are together on that. But thank you for coming on the show. I really enjoyed the conversation today. I know I learned a lot. Do you have any last thoughts for the audience before we say goodbye?
Let's see if we can summarize. I think just learning to work with your body versus against it is incredibly powerful. It can change your life. It can open up your life to like much more meaningful things when you're not caught in this struggle. So if you are caught in this struggle, there is hope. It can feel different. So that's what I'll end on. So thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Oh my gosh, an absolute pleasure. Thank you again. And thank you everybody for tuning in. We will have another show again in a couple of weeks, but until then, take care and stay safe out there.